One of the more obvious locations where the Cold War was waged was in the Caribbean basin. Most would think of places like Cuba, Grenada, or possibly Haiti or the Dominican Republic. But as we have said in previous episodes, the Cold War was fought everywhere, and this naturally would include places not traditionally associated to the conflict. And this includes a piece of US territory which saw an aggressive independence movement run up against Washington's need to hold a strategic position to be able to exert influence in the region and beyond. I'm your host David, and today we're going to explore the Cold War history of Puerto Rico. This is the Cold War. Before we dive in, a bit of context. Of the 5 US territories, the largest and most populous is the island of Puerto Rico, lying to the east of Hispaniola. The island is home to 3 million people and remains one of the US's last territories, which means it lacks the full representation and rights afforded to the 50 states that make up the United States. This status is long-running, but remains controversial to this day. Puerto Ricans also form a large diasporic community in the mainland United States and continue to play a significant role in American economic and cultural life, as Bad Bunny tried to show everyone at the 2026 Super Bowl. Okay, so Puerto Rico was first colonized by Europeans in 1493 with Christopher Columbus leading the initial expedition. The island became part of the Spanish New World Empire, during which its vibrant native population, the Taino people, were largely exterminated as part of the broader indigenous genocide undertaken by the Spanish. The island's economy, like much of the Caribbean, revolved around cash crops, especially sugarcane, and thus was a node of the transatlantic slave trade. Keep in mind that slavery within the Caribbean was so profitable that Spain only abolished the practice in the late 1800s, with slavery becoming formally outlawed in Puerto Rico in 1873. The island's history was often violent, with numerous invasions and slave revolts. Many islanders felt little loyalty to Spain, and from the 1800s onwards, there was a consistent push for independence, although these independence movements were riven with divisions between wealthier white settlers, predominantly of Spanish and European descent, and colored, who were usually poorer and of mixed African, European, and Native heritage. Puerto Rico came under the control of the United States as part of the Spanish-American War of 1898. It joined along with other territories such as Cuba and the Philippines, giving the US its first taste of an overseas empire. However, the idea of ruling overseas colonies in the same fashion as the Europeans were doing contrasted with the US core principles, and thus the US sought to present itself as an instructor for these nations who would then be granted independence after a sufficient period of tutelage. It's worth noting that even at the time, the parochial and racist aspects of this position were recognized, but the US effectively retained control of its Spanish possessions until after the Second World War. Cuba became independent in 1902, but US influence was very high and remained so until the 1959 revolution there. The Philippines were released in 1946, leaving only Puerto Rico and the Pacific Islands under control of the US, a situation that remains to this day. The reasons for these territories being retained were mixed, but essentially, unlike in a place like Cuba, which had a large settled population, the smaller size of Puerto Rico offered many economic opportunities for American citizens, while its territorial status also served as a way to circumvent US tax and customs laws. It also was strategically significant. So, much like Hawaii in that particular regard, there was no desire to release the territory, but also no push to make it a state. Within Puerto Rico, the split between those who wanted either independence, statehood, or to remain a territory widened, and no overall consensus emerged. This became more complicated when in 1917 Puerto Ricans were granted US citizenship, and therefore became able to immigrate to the US without restriction, as well as enjoy all the benefits of citizenship. Indeed, to this day, the US Census Bureau estimates that up to 50% of people who identify as Puerto Rican live in the mainland US. Despite this, agitation for independence never went away, and neither did political violence. Throughout the 1930s, many in Puerto Rico protested in favor of independence, which led to political repression and violence from the authorities. Displaying the Puerto Rican flag or other symbols of independence was punishable by up to 10 years in prison. Numerous independence advocates were arrested, and in 1937, in one of the worst cases of political violence, 17 protesters were killed in the town of Ponce on Palm Sunday during a protest against the imprisonment of pro-independence politicians. The massacre sparked a retaliatory attack against the US appointed governor in 1938. Subsequent concessions by the US government helped to de-escalate the situation, but did not end the agitation for independence. Puerto Rico's status as a strategic naval base made it crucial to the US throughout both the First and Second World Wars, as a base from which to assist in controlling the Atlantic. After the Second World War, President Truman's administration moved to formalize the relationship between the US and Puerto Rico. Independence was out of the question, as the Nationalists were seen as radical and therefore outside the possibility of US control, but equally, statehood remained a divisive subject. The local Puerto Rican elites were more comfortable with maintaining the loose association between the US and the island, as it afforded them many of the benefits of statehood, including citizenship, without the obligations required of those living in a proper state, particularly the need to pay federal income tax. Additionally, many in the mainland were uncomfortable with admitting Puerto Rico, as the island, despite decades of US occupation, remained majority Spanish-speaking and had a unique and vibrant Hispanic culture which clashed with the then segregated US cultural norm. Puerto Ricans themselves feared the loss of their cultural identity and were hesitant to accept statehood. And as for the nationalists who still desired independence, well, they weren't willing to accept what they saw as an elite desire to stitch up a deal with the US. Indeed, fully a third to as much as one-half of the island's population favored an independent republic. This febrile political atmosphere led to a series of attacks and revolts in the 1950s. The Puerto Rican Nationalist Party launched an insurgency on October 30th, 1950, which saw a series of attacks across the island in an effort to spark an uprising. The most successful of these attacks was the Ayala uprising. The Nationalists took control of the town of Ayala and declared it a republic. However, Puerto Rican National Guard units, backed by both US Air Force and Navy, crushed the uprising. The revolts ultimately failed, forcing the Nationalists underground. And then, only 2 days after the Ayala uprising was crushed, 2 gunmen tried to force their way into Blair House, the presidential guest house where President Truman was in residence as the White House underwent renovations. DC police officer Leslie W. Caulfield was killed, and the 2 gunmen were taken into custody. It's worth noting the 2 gunmen were longtime residents of New York and were merely inspired by events in Puerto Rico rather than being directed by any nationalist plot. Then, in 1952, Puerto Rican citizens voted overwhelmingly for a new constitution, which formalized its status as a Commonwealth territory. Up to 82% of those who voted accepted the new Commonwealth status, which in effect gave Puerto Rico more local autonomy, but left it as a protectorate of the United States. The vote allowed for a raft of new civil liberties, including, for example, that the display of the Puerto Rican flag was no longer considered sedition. Independence and statehood advocates, however, both found the referendum illegitimate, as it only allowed a binary yes or no vote on Commonwealth status and did not include the option to vote for statehood or independence. Violence continued, and in 1954, 4 Puerto Rican nationalists unfurled a Puerto Rican flag in the visitors' gallery of the US House of Representatives and opened fire on the congressmen below. 5 congressmen were wounded, and all 4 assailants were arrested. The leader of the attack, Lolita Lebrun, declared she had not come to kill anyone, but to die for Puerto Rico. After the uprisings and the 1954 attack in Washington, tensions cooled as Puerto Rico's economy began to improve. While still dominated by agriculture throughout the 1960s, the island began to develop as a major destination for tourists from the mainland. Casinos, duty-free shopping, and cruises helped to build a burgeoning tourism industry. Although there remained a stark divide in the island between rich and poor, and many mainlanders, although they visited the island, did little to interact with the local culture. This dynamic was captured by the famous American gonzo journalist Hunter S. Thompson, who lived and worked on the island in the 1960s. His book, The Rum Diary, published later in his life, although fictional, captures many of the inequalities and injustices that the people of Puerto Rico felt. In an interesting twist on its colonial legacy, Puerto Rico also became a destination for a very different sort of tourism. Specifically, it became a destination for women to be able to undergo medical abortions. In 1937, changes in US legislation in Puerto Rico led to the creation of Malthusian clinics to limit the population through sterilization. This was of course rife with abuse, but in many cases did offer women an option for birth control after they had already had children. A strange byproduct of this was that doctors were given the authority to decide if a woman needed to undergo an abortion if one was requested. Unlike in most of the United States, abortion was not banned, and as a result, several thousand women from the US mainland traveled to the island to undergo the procedure. Now, that shift towards tourism in Puerto Rico was not accidental, but rather part of a broader US policy undertaken in the context of the Cold War to transform Puerto Rico's economy. It was felt in Washington that much of the hostility towards the US stemmed from Puerto Rico's economic system, which remained focused on the sugarcane industry that employed up to 1/5 of the population. In 1945, the US government began and subsequently continued to invest in Operation Bootstrap, the effort to drive Puerto Rico to develop an industrial and tourist economy. While the results were mixed, the overall standard of living, although remaining below the continental US, did rise and the economy diversified. It's worth noting that much of the manufacturing established on the island was driven by US firms being able to pay lower wages in Puerto Rico and still market their goods as made in the USA. But throughout the 1960s, the island did see material improvement in its living conditions. Let's keep in mind that Puerto Rico was not immune to the broader dynamics of the Cold War. The 65th Infantry Regiment of the Puerto Rican National Guard saw service in Korea, and an estimated 48,000 Puerto Ricans served in Vietnam. On the island itself, the FBI and CIA watched nationalists suspiciously during the COINTELPRO program. This became especially pronounced after 1959, when Cuba, a close US ally to that point, saw its own nationalist, then communist revolution. Unsurprisingly, Puerto Rican nationalists were influenced by their new communist neighbors. Filiberto Ojeda Rios, who lived in Cuba, was influenced by Cuban communist ideology, as were other American left-wing activists. The turbulent 1960s and 70s saw the emergence of a number of new left-wing Puerto Rican groups who were influenced by the cause of independence and the growing radicalism of the American left. Puerto Ricans in the US faced racial discrimination and police brutality alongside many other minority groups, which led in many cases to them making common cause with groups like the Black Panthers. From this mixing of radicalism and nationalism emerged the Fuerzas Armadas de Liberación Nacional, the Armed Forces of National Liberation, or FALN. Although it was likely never more than 20 people strong, the FALN would become one of the most prolific militant groups of the 1970s and 80s. They carried out a suspected 130 bomb attacks in the United States, mostly targeting commercial enterprises and offices to, in their words, weaken the Yankee capitalist monopoly and to demand the release of the Puerto Rican nationalists jailed for the attacks on the US Congress and President Truman. The FALN and other revolutionary groups would set off bombs or carry out arson attacks, then claim credit in the press. They also undertook robberies to fund their activities, including a robbery carried out by the militant group Los Macheteros, who in 1983 stole $7 million from a Wells Fargo depot in West Hartford, Connecticut. That's the equivalent to more than $22.6 million in 2025. A real spicy meatball, as the kids would say. Now, despite the high number of attacks from the FALN and other groups, they rarely inflicted casualties, instead seeking to draw attention to their cause rather than maximize death. The most lethal attack carried out by the FALN was the 1975 bombing of Fraunces Tavern in New York that killed 4 people and injured 50 more. But despite the FALN's energetic activity, they were never a large or well-supported group, and they began to run out of steam in the 1980s. In 1979, President Jimmy Carter commuted the sentences of the remaining nationalists from the congressional attack, taking away one of the causes of the FALN was fighting for. Many of the FALN members were subsequently arrested or even fled to Cuba. President Bill Clinton would commute their sentences in 1991. Filiberto Ojeda Rios, one of the main instigators, however, would live underground for an extended time but be shot and killed by FBI agents in 2005 in Puerto Rico. After the 1990s and the collapse of the USSR, left-wing militarism waned in Puerto Rico. The Civil Rights Act, the growing US economy, and the expansion of civil rights to Puerto Ricans, as well as the proliferation of second and third generation Puerto Ricans living in the US, meant that people of Puerto Rico, although maintaining a separate identity, were gradually integrated into broader US culture. Puerto Ricans represent a powerful political constituency in New York City, which as of now remains home to more Puerto Ricans than San Juan, the island's capital. In fact, the popular American sitcom Seinfeld's episode the Puerto Rican Day Parade is the only episode of the series removed from syndication due to its perceived slight against Puerto Rican culture. As to Puerto Rico's ambiguous political status, the island is still considered to be a colony by many, and its status is nebulous and undefined. Puerto Rico has often been discussed as becoming a 51st state, but there's never been sufficient political will to see it through. The island's economic and political reforms were driven in part by a need for the US to maintain strategic control over the island during the Cold War, while its radical nationalist movement gradually lost support as they were influenced by communist or left-wing ideologies most Puerto Ricans did not support. At this time, most Puerto Ricans remained content with the status quo, as while they lack the political rights of states, their autonomous status has allowed them to preserve a vibrant and unique culture which remains part of a broader fabric of American society, shaped and reshaped by the Cold War. Ongoing financial challenges have been exacerbated by financial limitations imposed on the island as part of its territorial agreement, as well as by significant natural disasters, including Hurricane Maria, have forced strict austerity measures on the island, resulting in some heavy cutbacks in public services. This has seen renewed calls to revisit Puerto Rico's relationship to the mainland, but as of the time of this episode being written, no serious progress is underway. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you subscribe to our channel and have fully pressed the bell button. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.